My name's Joey Molloy. I know some of you. I just met a couple of you, or Daniel, I just met this morning, which is awesome. And it's good to have you here. We do a webinar. We try to do one at the end of every month. And this year, we took a little bit of a hiatus over the summer, but what I'm hoping to do is focus our webinars a little bit more on very specific ministry tools or ministry helps, if you will, specific areas. And so anyway, more on that as we move along. So with that, let's get started with the webinar. Feel free to tap your questions into the chat box as we go along. And then, like I say, we can have a bit of a conversation towards the end of this presentation as well. All right, so today's topic is delegating delicately, and if you know me, and some of you know me well enough to know, this is something that I've lived for a long time, and when it comes to delegating, oftentimes we think of it in terms of, how can I get the most done or the most accomplished and so on. And I'd like us to, although at the end of the day, that's essentially what we need if we're going to grow the ministry and grow the impact and so on and involve other people. But let me start by taking a look at, I think, 2 or 3 key delegation moments in Scripture and what we can learn on it, and maybe turn the tables on how we think about it, rather than getting something accomplished. Rather, what would it look like if we actually invested in people? So with that, let's take a look at Moses, Jesus, and of course you, and what we can learn from those people. The story of Moses is a long and in some ways complicated story of his interaction with God, his interaction with man, God actually delegating some things for Moses to do to his people. Moses, of course, trying to figure out what that looks like in his own ministry. And in the story in Exodus chapter 18, we see Moses now receiving people day and night. We understand that there's well over 1 million people probably at this point in the desert, trying to figure out this new way of doing life, trying to figure out what it means to be a follower of God. And bringing basically all of their complaints, all of their struggles, and looking for that wisdom. And Moses, of course, is this guy that they come to. And morning and night, they come to Moses. They're asking for wisdom. They're asking for input, and Moses is able to give that. The problem is, of course, is that the lineup just never ends. And the only thing I can kind of think of that is comparable is, a couple weeks ago now with the Queen dying, and I was at least what I saw was lineups of people just lined up to walk by her casket. And at one point, I think I read somewhere that it was over 24-hour wait just to be able to walk by her casket, and people were standing in line that long to do that. And this is, of course, that idea, and probably then some of people coming to Moses. So Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, he is watching all this, and I don't pretend to know the relationship between Jethro and Moses. I only know my father-in-law and my relationship, and I can imagine how he would instruct me if he wanted to give me some wisdom. But Jethro comes along and he says to Moses, "Why are you doing this? Why are you putting other people through this?" And in the story, we see 4 things that we can pick out of what Moses learns. The first thing is that God uses different people to deliver his wisdom. Okay. And so it doesn't always have to be us that delivers what's needed. Okay. If you're in a small ministry and you're running with 4, 5, 10, 15 students, maybe you've got 2 or 3 trusted leaders that work with you. Basically, you can set up a system, and it's easy, where you're the person. You're always the one they come to. And that can work sort of, kind of, but it won't help you grow your ministry, because you'll constantly be kind of stuck in that size of ministry. But more than that, what you're potentially robbing your students of is the opportunity to have other people speak into their lives, other people do things. And I'm not just talking about teaching or small group ministry. I'm talking about leading games. I'm talking about, running activities. I'm talking about just putting together a schedule. We're working on a youth camp coming up next weekend. And I've got some people that are working on it. We had a meeting last night, and they're throwing ideas out that they want to do that I've never even thought of. And part of me went, oh, that's not the way I would do it. But then part of me went, wow, if I didn't empower them to do it, they'd be stuck with my old ideas, and the students would miss out on all these creative ideas. So God uses different people to deliver his wisdom, and Moses needed to see that. The second thing we see from this story is that we cannot do it all ourselves. Okay. And there's a reason why we cannot do it all ourselves. One is we're not all that important. Okay. So practically, there's no way Moses could keep up with everybody and everybody getting satisfied. Eventually, people would go, I'm not waiting this long. He's just saying the same things over and over again. It's not, it's just not good wisdom. I need to hear a different voice. So we're not physically capable of doing it all ourselves anyway. But more than that, we're not that important. Okay, and I mean that lovingly. I know some of you guys on this call very well, and some of you watching in a little bit later, I probably know, and you know me. God loves us. We have intrinsic value because we're created in the image of God. But let's be honest with ourselves. We're not that important. Okay. What's more important is the student's relationship with God and how to get there. The second thing is that we ought not attempt to rob God of his glory. When I was going through Bible school and early in ministry, it was kind of pounded into me that anytime anyone pays you a compliment, you always say, oh, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Good things are happening. Praise the Lord. Bad things are happening. Praise the Lord. And you're always quick to push that attention to God. And I think it's a good practice for us to kind of get in the habit of is when something good is happening, is it because I'm really skilled at fill in the blank? Or is it because God is awesome and he's doing some really cool things and I kind of just get to be a part of that? And when we pass things on to others and allow them to have a significant part in quote unquote our ministry, what we're saying is that we're saying, God, I'm actually putting it back to you so that you can be glorified through me, but also through the other people in the ministry that are coming alongside to help out. So Moses, I think, had to learn that as well. The third thing I want us to see is that empowering others is good. It's good to empower others. It's good for you to empower others because it, quite frankly, takes a little bit of a load off of you. But more than that, it allows God to use you in a different kind of way, in a way that says, I want to use you to help others be used to bring students closer to God. And that's a good thing. It expands your ability to be used and quite honestly, your professional skills, if you will, as well. Empowering others is good for them, as in it's good for the people you're empowering, whether it's that summer intern or whether that's a volunteer that's helping you in the youth ministry or whatever the case may be. It's good for them to be empowered. It's good for them to know from you that you believe in them enough that you're going to give them this little extra to do, this task to do. And it's good for the masses. It really is much better. And go back to Moses' story, of course, all these people coming. Now, all of a sudden, he sets up a system where people are being able to actually be ministered to more effectively, more efficiently. And so it's better for them. And on a more personal note, it's better for students. And again, we're trusting God that the right students are going to be with the right person at the right time, whether it's more of a spiritual matter, more of a practical games, food, etc. type of matter, that we're trusting that the right relationships are being put together so that God actually knows who it is he wants to speak to that student. And guess what? It might not be you. And so it's good for the students when they can come and find someone that is more specific to their situation. The last youth ministry I was in, vocationally at least, it was a tough lesson for me to learn because I like to be the guy that people come to. I like to be the name that students drop when they're getting baptized and they're sharing their testimony and they're telling about, how great God is. And, oh, thank God he used Joey in my life to, my pride says I want to hear my name there. I remember the first time I heard actually, one of my interns' names dropped at a baptism. I'm in the tank ready to baptize this kid, and they're dropping someone else's name about how impactful they were in their lives. And I'm trying to smile and be the good, mature pastor and all this. But in my heart, I'm going, wait a minute, I want to be that person, But then I heard the rest of the story, and I heard how that person impacted them. And I realized that person had way more of a personal impact on this student's life that I couldn't have just because of who that person is, their story, and so on. And as the person was sharing their story in the baptismal tank, and I'm kind of standing there awkwardly processing all this, I'm thinking to myself, is this really about me, or is it about the student being ministered to? And I think I was able to process it for the most part, but I still think about that a little bit. So it's better for the masses when we empower others as well. And the fourth thing that we need to pay attention to here also is that you and your team need to know what issues need to be elevated to you. So again, if you're the point person in your ministry, whether you're the youth pastor in a local ministry or whatever the case may be, if you know you're the point person, you need to make sure that when you're empowering, that they know what issues do need to be elevated to you. In other words, what decisions you can't make on your own. And they just need to know that and be aware of that, because you don't want decisions being made that are going to, have them in over their head, if you will, in making those decisions, because it does fall back on you. Okay, so those are some lessons we can learn, and I encourage you, if you have some time, to read through the story in Exodus 18, and there's so much more there to unpack. But for now, those are four things at least we can learn through what Moses learned in his ministry journey. Jesus now, when we move to Jesus, let me see if this works. Look at that. Let's move myself out of the way so you can see the passages. Jesus taught in at least three cases. He sent people out. And in doing that, he taught them and us some things that we ought to be aware of. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus sends out the 12 apostles. Okay, and says in verse 3, take nothing for your journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, and do not have two tunics. And whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And wherever they do not receive you, then leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them. And it goes on. So he gives them these instructions. And then in Luke chapter 10, he sends out the 72. And he talks to them about what's going on and what they should be doing. Look at verse 2 of chapter 10. And he said to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go out. And he sends them out, and again, he gives them instructions, okay? And then the third passage that I want to highlight, of course, is Matthew 28. And in Matthew 28, we see the Great Commission. And the Great Commission that we see verse 18, and Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. And there's 5 things that I kind of pulled out of these passages that help us inform sort of a theological approach to delegating and to empowering others. 1, Jesus chose who he was going to send out. He chose them for a specific task. When he sent out the 12, when he sent out the 72, and then when he sent out the 11, I guess, where he commissioned his disciples, and by extension commissioning us, because we are disciples of disciplers who are disciples of disciplers all the way back. So we understand that chain. So he chose who he was going to empower and for what task. Let me encourage you, when you're thinking about who you're delegating to, know the people. Okay, it shouldn't, if you find yourself in a room with like 10 people and you've met them all like 3 times, and you're like, okay, here's what we're going to do. You're going to do this. You're going to do this. I'm going to task you with putting together the teaching assignments, et cetera, et cetera. Probably not a good idea. One example as to why not: when you're trying to put together, say, your teaching calendar for the year, and you don't want to be the person teaching every single week. That's all good. When you're thinking about who you're going to teach, or who you're going to have teach, you want to make sure that you understand who they are, what they believe, and what it is they're going to be teaching. Okay, and so again, the last church that I worked at was a fairly, on the Calvinist side of the equation, and in a lot of ways. And I remember having one of my volunteers volunteer to teach a Sunday school class, a youth class for me. And I said, great, sounds good. Here's the material. Go at it. It had nothing to do with Calvinism or Arminianism. It had a completely different subject. And I went in a different room teaching another class. He's in the other room teaching some students at the same time. I get home, I'm thinking it was a good Sunday at church. And within an hour or so, my email starts getting lit up by parents who were upset because their their students came home saying, we were taught that. And it was contrary to the doctrinal distinctives that our church held. And I'm sitting there going, that's impossible because that wasn't even the topic that was being discussed. That's not even the material going on. I further dug down into what they were talking about. Then I went back to the teacher and he goes, well, yeah, we were talking about this, but they asked a question. I felt like the Spirit was leading me just to share this. And I'm like, well, I'm glad that that's how you thought the Spirit was leading you, but that's not exactly where we're at, and so on and so forth. So I had a mess to clean up. Okay. And we'll talk more about that as we get into some practical ideas as we go along. But what I learned in that situation is I need to know who the people are that I'm empowering. I need to know, as Paul says in Corinthians, who's going to be an ambassador for what it is we're trying to get across. So if you have a strong doctrinal distinctives in your church or your ministry, pay attention to that. If you have a strong philosophy of ministry and how you want to do things, make sure you know that the people that you're empowering are going to further that message for the students. It's not going to be a contradictory message to the students, okay? And I'm not talking about choose people that'll be puppets for you. I'm talking about choosing people that you know who they are. And the other part about knowing who they are is being able to give them tasks that are within their abilities and their giftings. Okay. And so if you have somebody who really desperately wants to lead worship, by the way, if it's ever me volunteering to you for that, immediately, kibosh that idea. I'm not that guy. That's not my gifting. But because you know that, you're not going to ask me to do that. In the same way, when you know who you're empowering, you're able to give them tasks that they're going to succeed at. So Jesus knew who he was empowering. And in Jesus' case, he actually chose them. Secondly, he empowered them. He gave them the authority to go and do this. You check out in Matthew 28, he says, all authority has been given to me. I'm telling you, therefore, based on the authority that I have, to go and do this. So if you're going to delegate to somebody, empower them. Don't just say, hey, go do this, but I'll be watching. Go do this, but if I give you the wave, that means stop, Go do this on Zoom, but if I mute you, then don't unmute yourself because, just take that as a sign that you're done. You're on a short rope here, You want to empower them. You want them to know that you believe in them based on what you know about them, who they are, and so on and so forth. Okay? So if you're going to delegate, actually empower the person to do what they're called to do. He sent them out. Interesting that Jesus says, go. And in that passage in Luke chapter 10, he goes, hey, the harvest is ripe. Like, go get them. Go after it. And he sent them out to do something. So make sure they know that they're being sent to do something and that you want them to do something on behalf of the ministry that you're in charge of. Okay. And the fourth thing we can learn from this is he expects us to go. And again, in that Matthew Great Commissioning, he tells us to go and make disciples. He expects that to happen. In fact, as the story goes in Acts, he sort of gives that Great Commissioning, and then he kind of just sort of floats up or ascends into the clouds. And as the story goes, the disciples are kind of looking up into the clouds, wondering when he's coming back. And the angel comes down and says, what are you looking up here for? Get back to work. Like Jesus expected them to go do it. So when you empower someone, you delegate something, you expect they're going to go give it a try. I sometimes say to my workers here at camp, I say, hey, I expect you to try. I expect you to give it your best shot. And again, I expect you to know when to ask questions and know when to know you're out of your realm of responsibility, but I expect you to go and give it a try. Okay, so he expects us to do this. And this last piece in verse 20, the last part, he says this, and behold, and that word and could also be translated therefore, behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. What Jesus is saying here is he's saying my presence is promised to you, but it's with the expectation that you're doing what I'm telling you to do. Okay, so Jesus promises that he's there for us. Okay, now we can't be Jesus. We're not the Holy Spirit. We can't be omnipresent and sort of always be there whispering into their ear and into their heart what to do and what not to do. But we can say to them, look, as you go, I've got you. I'm here for you. I'm a phone call away. I'll be in the other room. I'm right here. And I'll give you some practical ideas on that in a moment. But know that you're not alone in this. Okay. And so we can learn some of these things from how Jesus delegated, sent out, and how he taught on that. Okay, let's keep going. A couple of practical things, and this is years ago. I'm at my church, and my senior pastor comes to me. There's a church of about I don't know how many people, but there's about 10 or 12 pastors on staff at the time, and I was the youth guy. And my senior pastor comes up to me one day, and he goes, "We should have our Tuesday afternoon staff meetings," and he would usually do some like a half hour, 45 minutes of training. And he came up to me one day, and he says, "Hey, Joey, I've noticed you're really good at delegating." And I'm like, "Oh, well, thanks." And he goes, "Would you mind, next week, taking the training time and just training us on some ideas on delegating? We could all learn from that." And I was like, "Great, sounds good. Yeah, well, I'll do that." So you got to appreciate the fact also that these Tuesday afternoon staff meetings tended to go on for a long time. I know none of you have boring long staff meetings each week, and I was always happy for them to end. And so I wasn't in a hurry to fill up a lot of time. And so my senior pastor, he starts the meeting. He pays a lot of compliments to me about how great I am at delegating. And now we're going to learn here from Joey. And Joey, you've got the floor. And I said, "Oh, great." I said, "Well, when it comes to delegation, you need to know this. If you can't get someone else to do it, you have to do it yourself." And that was all I had. And then I looked at him, I go, "That's it." And that was my number one rule of delegation for years. If you can't get someone else to do it, you have to do it yourself. And I remember my pastor just looking at me like, "Really? That's it?" I'm like, "That's really it." And staff meeting ended early that day, and everyone but him was very happy about that. So I've added a second rule. Okay, it's taken me a while to come up with a second rule, but the first rule is this: if you can't get someone else to do it, you have to do it yourself. Now that sounds pretty simple, but think about this. When it's you say your youth group's on Tuesday night, and it's Tuesday, and you're getting there at 6 a.m, and you're running all day long, and by the time 7:30, 8 o'clock comes at night, and your students are waiting for you to teach them because you've done everything, and your brain isn't working properly because you're exhausted, and you're not able to teach them well, assuming that's your primary task as their youth pastor, then you've probably failed because you've had to do everything because you didn't find anyone else to do it for you. Okay. So again, it sounds like a simple rule, but take it seriously. You don't want to be Moses. You don't want to be the person that does everything because you can't get anyone else to do it for you. All right. In other words, work hard at not working all that hard. Okay. I'm not advocating for being lazy. I'm not advocating for getting everyone else to do your job so you don't have to do it. What I am saying, though, is look for people that can do jobs so that you don't need to do them. And in doing that, you're doing all the good things we talked about in the previous slides. You're empowering them. But more than that, you're actually giving yourself more space to do the things that God has called you to do. Okay. And if we need an example of that, just think of all the times that Jesus gave his disciples tasks to do, and then he would pull away and spend time praying with the Lord. Okay, he would pull away to do the things that he's meant to do. Think about Mark chapter 1, I think it's verse 29, where Jesus pulls out of the city. The disciples come to him and they say, "Hey, everybody's looking for you, so you can come heal them some more." And he says, "Actually, we need to move on because we have to go preach now." Okay, and what Jesus is saying is, I need to prioritize what I need to be doing here, and that means I have to find other people to do some of these things. Okay, second rule is this: if the job is not done properly, it falls back on the delegator. So it's not as simple as saying, "I got 10 things to do and 10 people. Let's just all pick a number out of the hat and that's what you're going to do." Or, "Hey, can you go do this as I'm running to do something else and just hope it gets done?" It's about really investing in the person that you're delegating to. That's sort of the delicate part of it. It's not just dumping a whole bunch of stuff on a whole bunch of other people. It's actually about making sure that the job's done right, because if it's not done right, it falls back on you. And again, the simple example I have on this is, I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I'll sometimes say to her, "Hey, do this." And I'll think she knows exactly what I mean, but she doesn't. She's playing hockey this year, so again, and she was at the rink the other day, and now she's a girl. My daughter's a girl, and because of her age, she plays in a girls' league. Dads aren't allowed in the dressing room. Okay, and so she's in this awkward time where she has to get dressed herself. Normally I would help her with her equipment. And so she's getting dressed herself. She comes out and I tie her skates and off she goes. But I don't have control over her remembering everything. I can't take a look in the dressing room under the bench to make sure everything's in the bag and so on. And so I really have to trust her to do all this. And one of the tasks is, and if you've played hockey or skated, you understand this, is that you have to actually dry the blades of your skates and then put the guard on them. Otherwise, they will rust and you'll be in trouble and so on. And so I said to her the other day, make sure you take care of your skates. Now, what I meant by that was dry them off, then put the guard on, put them in the bag. What she took from that is quickly throw the guard on, throw them in the bag. And so fortunately, her next ice time was close enough that when I uncovered the skates and saw that they were still soaking wet and rust was starting to form, I was able to clean them before too much damage was done. And the reflex for me in that case was to go, I need to yell at my daughter so she does not do this again. I caught myself because I realized I didn't delegate very well. And so the fact that these blades are starting to get rusty is on me because I didn't communicate clearly enough exactly what it is I wanted her to do. Okay. And so keep that in mind as you're delegating. Again, who you're talking to, a student, a volunteer, what they're able to do within their giftings and so on. Okay. All right, let's keep going. We delegate for two reasons. One, to accomplish more. All right. And again, make sure the job's being done correctly. But if you want to accomplish more, think back to Moses in our example there. If you want to accomplish more, you need to delegate. It's just that simple. The second reason, though, that we delegate, and I put it second, but I really do want to highlight it because it speaks to the heart of who we are as youth pastors, youth leaders, is this. We delegate to further the discipleship process. Okay. In other words, we want to make sure that as we're delegating, this is actually part of the discipleship process. So sometimes we go, I teach on Sunday mornings and Tuesday nights. That's my discipleship. I go for coffee with students and build into their lives, or I go to their games or whatever, and that's discipleship. Okay. But when I delegate, that's just getting tasks done. But actually getting the tasks done and delegating to these leaders or students or wherever it is should be considered part of the discipleship process. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. Some practical guidelines. One, know who you are empowering. Again, I know I mentioned this under what we learned from Jesus, but know who it is you're empowering. Know where they're at in life to the best of your ability. Know what they're capable of. Know what they're not capable of. I can remember when I was in grade 4. So that would have put me at what, like 9, 10 years old, maybe. My parents were involved in starting a Christian school, and they got this building. And as a 10-year-old, you don't really know much about what's going on, other than I found myself with my brothers and sisters cleaning this old schoolhouse that became the Christian school that they started. I'm just there and I'm just raking because I was told to rake, and that's just what I was doing. All of a sudden, this other dad, a guy named Glenn, he walks up to me and he had his car with a trailer behind it. It was full of brush, and he goes, Joey, and he throws me the keys to his car, and he says, go take the car down to that pile and unload it. And I catch the keys and I look at him. I'm 10, maybe 11, right? And I look at it and I go, what is he talking about? I'm like, drive the car, okay. So I get in the car, I fire it up, and I start driving it down this field towards this pile. And I don't know how to drive. I'm like steering away. Like, I grew up on a farm, so I got a track, but I'm kind of steering away. And I get there and I put it in park and I start unloading the trailer. And Glenn and my dad are running down the field towards me. And I think they realized that they'd given the keys to the wrong guy. Glenn thought I was my older brother, who was old enough that maybe he could have driven the car. And they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, you told me to drive. So I drove it. And they're like, and then everything was okay. And it all went on from there. But they weren't paying attention to who they were empowering in that moment. So know who you're empowering. Okay. Secondly, be clear with what they are to do and not to do. Okay, I'm asking you to do this, but I'm not asking you to do this. From a previous example I've shared, I'm asking you to teach this subject. I'm not asking you to venture into this theological construct that has been challenging people for centuries. This is what I'm asking you to do. Okay, and depending on who the person is, the more clear you have to be with what they're to do, and in some cases what they're not to do, because depending on the personality, and you ask them to do 3 or 4 things, they might stop at 1 or 2 because they don't want to make a mistake. The other side is you could have a personality that when you say, you know what, I want you to do these 3 or 4 things, they're so confident that they might do 5, 6, or 7 things. And they might go, oh, he said this, but I'm pretty sure he meant this, so I'll just keep going and doing this. You want to be clear with exactly what you want them to do. And a nice little rule to remember when it comes to delegating, especially when it's early in the relationship with the person you're delegating to, is small success is better than a big failure. So if you can give them like 1 or 2 things to do and they can succeed at that, and you can come back and encourage that and so on, that's better than saying, hey, just sort of go and do this. And then whatever happens, and all of a sudden you got a big failure, a big mess to clean up. Okay. The third thing is this, just a bit of a way to think about it. You want to, you give them what to do. Okay. So you want to inspect what they're doing. You want to instruct them as they're doing it. And then you want to encourage them on the back end. Okay. So what I mean by this, and some of you know, I work at a camp now, so I have students here all summer and they're doing different jobs and so on. I might say to them in the morning, hey, there's 6 of you here. Here's the 6 jobs you're going to be doing. You go here, you go here, you do this, you do this. Everybody understand what they're doing? Good. And then what I'll do is I'll go and have a nap and hope everything works out well. No, what I'll do is I'll start walking from job site to job site, and I'll just kind of walk around and I'll check in to see what they're doing, make sure they got the idea and they're actually doing it. If they need a little bit of instruction along the way, I'll give them that instruction in the moment so that they can be successful in the moment, not just tell them what they did wrong afterwards. And then along the way, and especially afterwards, I'm going to encourage as best I can. And I like to think of encouragement as authentic encouragement. When I encourage somebody, I want them to really believe that they've done something well. And so I'm not the kind of guy that just encourages everything. Like, you completely burn down a building, but boy, did you ever do good at letting that match. Like, that's to me not encouragement. That's just like, the kindergarten kid whose painting goes on the fridge no matter what they bring home. I want to encourage what I can actually encourage, but you want to encourage them. You want to make sure that they know that the parts of the job that they did that were good. And if you kind of keep cycling through that last one there, inspect, instruct, encourage, that can help a lot along the way. Okay. Final thing I want to say, and then we can do some interaction here and so on, is this. Disciple making is the ultimate goal of delegating. Always remember that when Jesus sent his disciples out, whether it was the 12 or the 72, and then again, the Great Commissioning, all of us, it was about making disciples for him. It wasn't about them accomplishing work. Okay. And I know, again, we're not Jesus. We're not God. We don't have this ability to just do whatever we want. And we're blessing people by allowing them to be a part of it. I know there's a very practical side to this where we just have to get things done and so on. And I get that. I'm just asking you to think about holding in tension this idea of accomplishing something versus really investing into making of disciples. Okay. And so I guess we have time for one more quick story here. Over the years and up until 5 years ago, I was a youth pastor in 3 different churches over 25 years. And early on in the process, for me, it was all about getting things accomplished. As life went on, I started to realize that to get things accomplished is one thing, but to make disciples is actually a lot more longer term fruit. And part of getting old and still being kicking around youth ministry world is you get to see some of that fruit. You get to see some of those students that maybe you even thought, all I'm doing here is getting you to do work for me. But somehow God's redeeming that. And somehow God's showing me that actually what you're doing is making disciples. And when you see some of your disciples making other disciples over the time, it's an encouraging thing. Okay. And so even if it's just self-serving, which a lot of it comes back to for me, if I'm being selfishly honest, being able to see disciples being made is a huge part of this delegating. And that's kind of what I meant by, other than just the wordsmithing, the delegating delicately is this idea of, are we driven in this to make disciples? Even if it's a brief interaction with somebody for a brief time, or maybe it's something more formal where you have students or leaders that you're supervising, whatever the case may be, make sure you've always got the disciple making piece as part of the overall goal, that idea of making disciples even while you're delegating. All right, there we go. Let's take a breath, and usually somebody else would be doing this, so I would cut in and say, hey, that was great. Let's take a minute and talk about Implementa before we ask questions. Let me share with you a couple things, then we'll do some Q&A because we've got some time, which is awesome. If you're looking for a fun camp, we've got our youth camp coming up here at Camp Carith next week, Thanksgiving weekend. It's a 4-day camp. It's not really a retreat, it's a camp. Josiah Milnes, my son actually, Sam Molloy, is going to be speaking at it. Josiah is going to be doing the music. So those of you in the area, just keep that in mind. We'd love to have you join us for that. Implementa is, most of you know kind of what I'm up to, but just so we're clear, Implementa primarily is about joining youth workers in the trenches and helping them through consulting, coaching, and training. We have some courses starting up actually Monday night. And I think we have 1 or 2 spots in one of the courses. Spiritual Formation is a course my friend Paul Racine is going to be teaching. And if you want to take a wonderful course on spiritual formation, I think we have 1 or 2 spots open in that if somebody wants to jump in on them. And then I'm going to be teaching a course called Building Your Team, how to recruit, equip, and inspire your ministry team, which kind of is a 10-week version of some of the things we covered here today as well. Okay. Our answered prayer, some of you know we did this last spring. We were in 5 different locations, and this year we're going to be trying to do this in January, February. And if you're part of a youth network, we'd love to be able to talk to you about setting up a date that works well for you. Daphne Richardson and Jason Prasad. Oh, let me move myself out of the way here. Hey, look at that. I'll move right in between them. And Jason's going to be speaking. Daphne's going to be doing music. This answered prayer is all about not just breaking down denominational barriers for the geographical church to aspire to a Trinitarian unity, but to break down cultural barriers. And if you know anything about Jason, he's been on a couple of our webinars here, and Daphne, you know that's a big part of who they are and what they're about. So tuck that away, and of course, anything that's popping out at you, just shoot us a message and we can chat more about it. Okay, next month. We have Alvin Lowe of Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec, and he's a good guy. He's just been kind of, I don't want to say behind the scenes because he has so much to offer, but he's good talking to us about the pieces of the administrative puzzle, and just talking about something that youth workers, stereotypical youth workers, often go, yeah, I'm really good at this, but I'm just not good at administration. And you roll your eyes and you think you're cute. And Anthony's going to Alvin's going to tell you that's, it might not be what you're good at, but here's some ideas to help you get better at it, because as professionals, we need to get better at the things we're not good at. And that's something we need to work on. So that's going to be good. And that's going to be at the end of October 26th. Okay.